Shadow highlight is found under the color correction category, and this effect is made for balancing out the shadows and highlights of an image. As you can see, I applied the effect to this video clip and it immediately brought up the shadows and brought the highlights down a little bit too. If I turn it off and back on, we get a much more balanced image and it looks really great. I also want to point out that this is a video clip, so it's actually by default using temporal smoothing, which means that it's looking ahead in the clip to kind of smooth out this adjustment so that it's not producing a flickering effect if the shadows and highlights change throughout the scene a lot. Now, this particular clip doesn't have that much change in exposure, so we wouldn't really see that flickering anyway, but we do have controls for that if you're using footage of, say, a time lapse in a car, going through different lighting scenarios like tunnels or behind buildings that are blocking the sun, things like that. Auto amounts is checked by default, so it is determining what it thinks the shadows and highlights balances should be, and it's making those adjustments independently. It's not an overall image brightness adjustment, it's adjusting the shadows and adjusting the highlights separately. Now we have a slider for temporal smoothing, which is measured in seconds. It's defaulted to 0, which means it actually is taking every single frame individually and making a correction to it. But as soon as you increase that to a different value, it's going to take the number of frames measured in seconds, surrounding this frame to analyze and make adjustments to so that it's nice and smooth and doesn't start flickering. We also have this scene detect checkbox, where if you're working with a video clip that has multiple shots within it, it's going to attempt to detect those changes in scenes and ignore the frames on the opposite side of that edit. Now, if I uncheck auto amounts, then I can independently control the shadows and highlights myself. It keeps the automatic values, but if I want to make those shadows a little bit brighter and maybe bring the highlights down as well, I could turn that value up. And that's important to note. Increasing the highlight amount is actually going to bring those highlights down. You can see it right in here on the owl's face. If I increase this, it gets a little dimmer. Now, I think that's an extreme adjustment. Having some contrast in the image isn't a bad thing, so I'm going to just dial that back a bit. But there's a custom adjustment instead of using the auto amounts. Next, we have more options, and there are a lot of controls in here. Shadow tonal width and highlight tonal width changes the range of shadows and highlights that this effect is actually going to modify. So if I make a pretty big shadow adjustment and then I turn the shadow tonal width down, it's going to adjust less of the darks in my image. Or if I increase that to a higher number, then more of my image is going to be affected by that shadow amount. So you can just think of these two as the range of shadows and highlights that we're affecting with these controls up here. The shadow radius and highlight radius controls is basically looking at every pixel and a radius around that pixel to determine if it is indeed a shadow or a highlight. So let me just reset this effect and increase the shadow radius. As I do this, you can see how that's affecting the image. I could do the same thing for the highlight radius. Turning it up or down is going to modify how those highlights and shadows are selected for adjustment. Then we have color correction. If I turn this all the way down to 0, then my image is going to get very desaturated. I'll turn this off and back on. That's just a natural occurrence of this effect because with that color correction off, it's only affecting the brightness values of these pixels, which makes everything look pretty dull. But if you increase that color correction, you're basically bringing in more saturation to the adjusted areas. So you don't want to go too far with this, but a value of 20 at default looks pretty natural and a whole lot better than if it were at 0. Next, we have mid-tone contrast, which is exactly what it sounds like. The tones in between the highlights and shadows basically, and how much contrast is applied to that. So I could increase that to get a more dramatic look. Again, this is with it off and back on. Or I could dial it back to a negative number to flatten out the contrast a little bit. I'll set that back down to 0. And then finally we have black clip and white clip. And these determine how much of the shadows and highlights are clipped to the new extreme shadow and highlight colors in the image. And what that really means is that if something already was pure black, then leaving this black clip at a default value of 0.01%, or even just changing this down to 0, is going to leave those black pixels unaffected. Same thing for the white clip. If you leave it at a very low value or a value of 0, the white pixels in the image will not be changed. But if I increase the black clip and increase the white clip to much higher values, then we're gonna get a lot more contrast. More colors in the image are gonna be clipped off into that black area, and more of the highlights are gonna be clipped off into pure white. And the last control we have is blend with original, which is just an opacity slider basically for this effect. But that's everything you need to know about shadow highlight. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all that stuff in the description of this video.